I had taken a week off from work so I could spend some time at the beach and recharge after a very grueling quarter. Unfortunately, there was a huge tropical storm on the day of my flight, so I had to cancel everything last minute. I still had a week off, so I decided to do a little staycation. I didn't tell anyone that I was still in town. With or without the beach, I needed my alone time. On my first day of vacation, I caught up on household chores and watched some movies. Nothing much happened until right before sunset, when I got a new message on my WhatsApp. The message said, "Hey Nikki, it's been forever. What's new?" It came from someone named Lori. I had no idea who Lori was. I clicked on her profile picture, which did nothing to jog my memory. She was an average-looking woman, about my age. I must have known her because I had her contacts saved on my phone, but for the life of me, I had no memory of ever meeting her. I should have asked who she was, but I felt too awkward. Instead, I replied to her message as if I knew her. I told her about my job and all my recent relationship drama. It felt really easy to talk to her. She asked me if I still kept in contact with Troy or Maddie. Those were some of my friends from college, which meant that I probably knew Lori from college too. I asked her questions about her life, which she answered, but nothing she said could jog my memory. We texted for a while, and I felt increasingly comfortable talking to her. I even told her about my staycation, making her the only one who knew that I was still in town. "Great," she wrote back. "Then you can come to my house party tomorrow." I politely told her no. I wanted to be by myself for the week. She totally understood. We continued texting for the next couple of hours before I went to bed. I still didn't remember her from college, but she definitely felt like an old friend. The next day, I checked in with some of my college friends for the first time in years. I asked them if they remembered a blonde girl named Lori. None of them did. I even sent them her photo to see if she looked familiar to them. She didn't. The mystery bugged me all day long. It was hard to relax when I kept thinking about Lori. By early evening, I got one more WhatsApp message from her. It read, "The party starts in an hour. I know you said you couldn't come, but my door is always open. It'll be like old times." Then she sent her address, which was only 10 minutes away. I wrote a very nice response telling her that I couldn't go, but then I erased it all. My curiosity was getting the better of me. I wrote, "I can make it." She answered with a thumbs up emoji. I spent an hour getting ready, and then I drove to the address. It was a small house on a suburban street, nothing too special. As I parked my car, I could tell that the party was already in full swing. There must have been dozens of people inside, all talking and laughing. I approached the door, both nervous and excited. Before I could knock, a man raced toward me from across the street. It looked like he'd been pacing back and forth. "You going to Lori's party?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "You're coming in too?" "I was going to," he said. "But I have to ask you, how do you know Lori?" "We're old friends," I answered, somewhat evasively. "Good," he said, "because she messaged me on WhatsApp like we were old friends, but I was too embarrassed to admit that I didn't remember her, and now I'm here." I told him that the same thing happened to me. This was more than just a coincidence. This was proof that Lori was trying to trick us. The man, who introduced himself as Juan, even theorized that Lori had somehow stolen our phones and secretly added her name into our contacts. I wasn't quite ready to believe that, but I couldn't think of any other explanation. Whatever the case, neither of us were comfortable going to the party anymore. We were both still so curious, though, so we found a hiding place in the bushes outside her house where we could see into the window. We saw Lori passing out cups of punch to all her guests. Then she clinked her glass, and all the talking and laughing stopped. "Welcome one and all," she announced. "It's so wonderful to see all my old friends again." The other people in the room all exchanged glances. I couldn't be certain, but it seemed like they were all as confused as I was. Lori must have used her WhatsApp trick on all of them, too. While Juan and I were crouched outside the window, Lori began to make a long, weird speech about friendship. It didn't make any sense. The guests were fidgeting in place. No one wanted to be there. And I would have been one of them too, if I hadn't met Juan before I entered. Lori finished her speech and shouted, "Cheers!" Juan nudged me in the side. "Do you see that?" He nodded toward the refreshment table behind Lori. There were 3 big bowls of punch, and under the table was a small box of rat poison. Juan and I both jumped up and slammed our fists against the window. "Wait! Stop! It's poisoned!" I couldn't see if any of the guests had drunk anything because Lori ran to the window and blocked our view. "Get out!" she screamed at us, pounding against the glass. Juan grabbed my hand and we raced back to the street. My car was closer, so we got inside and called the police. The cops arrived almost immediately and arrested Lori. At her trial, we learned that she went from town to town, stealing phones in public places, adding her contact information, striking up conversations, and luring strangers to her mass poisonings. She always targeted shy people who were more likely to pretend to remember someone out of politeness. We also learned that absolutely no one at her last party died. Juan and I had warned them all in time. My wife, Janice, and I moved into a beautiful new house. It was in an isolated neighborhood just outside of town, and we both loved it. The place was so much bigger than our little apartment in the city, and we got a great deal from its previous owner, Bruce, who had been facing foreclosure. Unfortunately, I didn't get to spend a lot of time at home. I had a pretty heavy workload, and with the added commute time, I really struggled to maintain a balance. I told myself that after a few weeks, things would settle down. Well, this settle down time lasted for over 2 months, and I was still barely seeing my wife. Then, one weekend, I finally had the chance to relax. I went around the house looking for any easy repairs that I could do. It was an old place, but Bruce had kept it in pretty good shape. I was checking out the porch lights when I noticed a piece of technology that I wasn't expecting. Our front door had a Ring camera, and judging by the little shining light, it was still active. This couldn't have been an oversight because we'd already been here for months, and I was pretty sure people had to pay a monthly fee to keep Ring cameras connected. Well, that could only mean that Bruce still had access to the camera. Every time we walked in and out of the house, he could see us. The thought unnerved me. I barely knew the man, but we hadn't left things on the best terms. He really didn't want to sell his house, and he wasn't happy with the final amount we agreed on. It took me a while to build up the courage, but I eventually called him on the phone. He didn't answer. I thought about calling the police, but that felt like an overreaction. After all, it could have been just an innocent mistake. I know a lot of people automatically pay for subscriptions without checking. That could very easily be the case here. But for a man who was so desperate for money, that didn't seem likely. I went to Janice to ask for advice, but she also assured me that it wasn't a big deal. If it really upset me, then we could just pay someone to rip the camera out of the door. I knew that Janice was right. I was overreacting. But I still felt paranoid. I was more aware of my surroundings, as if I expected to spot Bruce sneaking around the yard or something. But in this more aware state, I noticed that some of our valuables had gone missing. A vase, my grandmother's earrings, some vintage books. I didn't know how that connected to the Ring camera, but it felt like there was something weird going on. Just in case, I logged into my banking website and saw that a very large sum of money was recently taken from one of our savings accounts. I decided not to tell Janice yet. I needed to get more information first. On Sunday, the banks weren't open, so I waited until Monday. I didn't tell Janice that I'd call in sick, so she thought I was still in the office. Instead, I went to our bank and talked with the cashier. She checked their records and saw that Janice had withdrawn the funds herself. I didn't believe her, so she had to call a manager in. I made such a fuss that he pulled me into the back room and showed me the security tapes of Janice withdrawing the money. Absolutely furious, I rushed back home. I was about to charge through the door when I stopped myself. I could hear voices coming from the living room. Through the window, I could see Janice lying on the floor. She was tied up and gagged. A man I had never met before was kneeling next to her, licking her feet. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I ran inside. Janice gasped when she saw me, but the noise was muffled by her gag. The man just froze in place, looking surprised but not embarrassed. Behind him, there were a dozen sets of high heels on the table, plus some stockings and a long feather. "What the hell?" I screamed. The man slowly stood up. Because Janice couldn't explain, he had to. He said that they'd met on Reddit and had been having an affair for weeks. He said that she was tired of being alone all the time, that I'd abandoned her for work, and that I couldn't satisfy her the way he could. By then, Janice had spat out her ball gag. She added, "And that creeper Bruce caught us on video. He's been blackmailing me." Now it all made sense. Not only was my wife a cheater and a freak, but she also stole from me to cover up her affair. This marriage was over. All I had to do was kick them both out of the house and call my lawyer. But no matter what I said, the man refused to leave. I'm a businessman, so I can talk very sternly, but I've never had to use physical violence before. It was clear that no matter what I said, he wasn't afraid of me. After telling him to get out for probably the 5th time, he smiled and walked over to the table. Then he grabbed a stocking and stretched it tight between his hands. He stepped closer. "What are you doing?" "I love her," was all he said. He jumped on me and wrapped the stocking around my neck. I struggled to shake him off me, but he refused to let go. He squeezed tighter and tighter. I couldn't breathe. Janice remained sitting on the ground. At any point, she could have said something to stop her lover, but she didn't. She just watched. Everything was going dark. I didn't have much time left. And then the front door slammed open and 2 policemen charged in. One grabbed the man and cuffed him, while the other helped untie Janice. I gave my statement, making sure to leave in every embarrassing detail. I expected them to take the man away in cuffs, but I didn't expect them to take Janice, too. I watched everyone leave, making sure to thank the cops. Once they were all gone, I noticed one more person standing just outside my porch. It was Bruce. He sheepishly walked over and apologized for blackmailing Janice. He said it was the biggest regret of his life. I was about to really lay into him when he added that he was the one who called the police. He'd watched me interrupt my wife's foot play, and when he didn't see anyone leave, he expected the worst and called 911. In the end, I forgave him. He still won't give back the money, though.
Tabby was my best friend in high school. We were like sisters. But then we graduated. I stayed in my hometown and went to the community college here, while Tabby joined the Peace Corps and spent 5 years in East Africa. When she left, I was so excited for her. I knew she'd have these wild stories to tell me during our Zoom calls. We planned to talk at least once a week. Unfortunately, her village in Tanzania didn't have any Wi-Fi. I'd send her emails, hoping that she'd respond during her monthly trips into the city, and at first she did, but over time, it was just too hard to reach her. I'd lost my best friend. Then, after nearly 5 years of silence, Tabby sent me a message that she was back in town and wanted to see me. I can't tell you how excited I was. We met the next day for lunch. She invited me over to her house, which was the same place where she'd grown up. Her parents had just moved away, so I guess they gave it to her. When she opened the door to greet me, I was shocked by how much she looked the same. Everything about her, from her hairstyle to her clothes, hadn't changed since high school. She still looked like she was a teenager. Meanwhile, I'd changed a lot. I think I look pretty good, but I'm definitely not the same woman I was at 17. Tabby excitedly pulled me inside. Her living room was completely packed with all kinds of boxes and tiny wooden crafts that covered every shelf and table. Clearly, she needed time to unpack. "Sorry about the mess," she said, and led me through the piles of boxes so we could sit on the couch. She excitedly explained that she'd met someone in Tanzania. His name was Jacob. Not only were they engaged, but they'd gone into business together. All these wooden crafts in her house were authentic pieces of Tanzanian art that Jacob made himself. She gushed over how talented he was and how much they loved each other. Their plan was to create an online craft shop where Jacob handled the crafts and Tabby handled all the business stuff. They seemed really committed to each other. I looked down at the wooden figurines and bowls on the coffee table in front of me. I was about to compliment them until I recognized one of the bowls. I'd seen the exact same thing somewhere. I couldn't remember if it was at World Market or Pier 1 or something, but it was definitely at some store. Curious, I picked up the bowl to look closer. Sure enough, I saw a faded circle on the bottom where it had a price sticker. This was fake. Maybe they all were. I instantly worried that Tabby's new business partner was lying to her. "Jacob made all these himself?" I asked. "Every single one," she said. I felt my heart sink. She had no idea. Who knew how much money she'd already put into this business? I hoped it wasn't too much. I was about to tell her that the crafts were fake, but then the front door opened and her fiancé came back. Jacob was a tall African man with an almost British-sounding accent. He stuck out his hand and introduced himself. I could tell right away how he could have duped Tabby the way he did. He was confident and very hot. Jacob sat with us and joined the conversation. He kept rubbing Tabby's shoulder and kissing her cheek while he explained his love of woodwork. Tabby, who must have heard all his stories before, acted like she was hanging on every word. It was a pleasant conversation, but all I could think about was how Jacob had tricked her. I needed to say something, but I couldn't find an opening. Plus, it was such an awkward thing to bring up in front of him. Eventually, Tabby left for the bathroom. Now that Jacob and I were alone, I figured I could just level with him. I knew it would be better for Tabby to hear about the scam from him directly. So I point-blank told him that his crafts were fake. His smile faded. "You don't trust me?" "No," I said. "You want me to stay away from Tabby, don't you?" he asked. "Yes," I answered right as Tabby re-entered the room. Jacob had seen her coming, but I hadn't. Tabby looked at me like I had just slapped her. From her point of view, it must have seemed like I was the jealous friend trying to scare off her fiancé. She told me to leave. I tried to explain what happened, but she refused to listen. She basically shoved me out the door. I knew I should have given her some space and let her figure things out on her own, but I just couldn't. Every day she was probably wasting more and more of her money while Jacob bought cheap garbage and passed it off as original stuff. The longer she stuck with her doomed business, the worse off she'd be. I had to do something. I got in my car and drove around the corner so they'd think I left. Then I snuck back into their yard, just to keep watch. I had a feeling I might be able to get some photo evidence of Jacob's scam. That would be the best way to force her to realize the truth. I waited in the bushes for a while, but all I saw was the two of them eating lunch together. I would have eaten with them if Tabby hadn't kicked me out. Obviously, I didn't get any evidence then, but after they were finished, Tabby did the dishes while Jacob went into the other room to unbox a bunch of store-bought garbage and peel off all the packaging and stickers. This was my proof. I took a bunch of photos, but I had to leave very quickly once it seemed that Jacob caught a glimpse of me through the window. I wasn't 100% sure that he had seen me, but I didn't want to risk it. I went back home and texted the damning photos to Tabby. She didn't respond. The little check marks in the corner showed that she didn't even open my messages. That didn't stop me, though. I went online and found out everything I could about Jacob. Apparently, he had a criminal record back in Tanzania for stealing and embezzlement. It looked like he had a really long history of scamming people. For the next few days, I drove by Tabby's house a lot. I needed to talk to her alone, but she and Jacob were always together. Then one afternoon, I finally got my chance. I saw that their car wasn't in the driveway and Tabby was all alone in the kitchen. I quickly parked and rushed to the front door. I kept knocking until she let me in. This time, there were even more boxes in the house. If anything, their business was expanding. Tabby was absolutely pissed to see me. I knew I didn't have much time before she kicked me out again, so thankfully, I brought some visual aids. I picked up some identical wooden bowls from the shop and showed her how they were identical to Jacob's supposed crafts. It was ironclad proof. Tabby took a deep breath and said, "I know." Slowly, she explained that she and Jacob were scammers together. They always had been. They'd met her first week in Africa. He convinced her to quit the Peace Corps and team up with him. They'd swindled one too many people back in Tanzania and decided to try their luck in America. This didn't sound like Tabby at all. When she left for Africa, she was full of excitement and ideals. She wanted to change the world, not rip it off. "Why?" I asked her. To answer me, she pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. I'd never seen so many digits. She was filthy rich now. And that's after buying this house for my parents, she bragged. "How could you make that much money?" I asked, assuming that they must have been involved in darker stuff too. "Because we work hard," she said, "and we don't let anyone get in the way." She stepped closer, her eyes dead serious. Someone grabbed my shoulder. I spun around to see Jacob looming behind me. He must have come in while Tabby was talking. His eyes were narrowed. "You're not gonna get in our way, are you?" They glared at me from both sides. I felt trapped. If these two were capable of stealing that much money, who knew what they'd do to me? I started to panic. No one knew I was here. If I disappeared, no one would be able to trace it back to them. I'd be a missing person forever. I was trembling. I had no idea what to do, so I eventually put up my hands and said, "Your secret's safe with me." To my total shock, they both wrapped me in a big hug. So now I'm roped into their scam too. I'm in charge of scratching up the products to make them look more authentic. I feel terrible about it, but I've already made $6,000. Every Halloween, my husband Devin turned our home into a walk-through haunted house. Each room had a different theme, usually horror movie inspired. Our neighbors loved it. Every year, Devin planned something more and more elaborate. We were even in the local news a couple years back when we did that big Stephen King-themed display. I've always enjoyed Halloween, but for Devin, it was a real passion. He spent most of the year drafting out plans and working on decorations in the garage. I loved that he was so passionate about something, especially because he never forced me to help out. This year, I didn't even know what the theme was. I never asked and he never told me. Despite all the hours he spent working in the garage, he hadn't shown me a single one of his new creations. By the beginning of September, I finally asked to see what he'd been working on. He excitedly brought me into the garage, which had been transformed into his Halloween workshop years ago. Fake stone altars and pillars leaned against the walls, each decorated with bizarre symbols and gibberish letters. The table was covered with metal chains and wires. There were a lot of decorations in the workshop, but none of them seemed particularly Halloween related. No skeletons or creepy dolls or fake cobwebs. He must have been going for a theme I didn't quite understand. He led me to his most recent project, the only real decoration that seemed to fit the Halloween theme, a 7-foot-tall goat demon statue sitting on a jagged throne. That seemed pretty creepy. Based on the statue and the weird symbols, I assumed he was going for some evil cult theme. I didn't want to ask him though, because if I expressed too much interest, then he might ask me to help. So I just told him everything looked wonderful and spooky, and I left. At the time, I didn't have any feelings about it one way or the other. I personally preferred his funnier themes, like the year we made our backyard into the spaceship from Killer Clowns from Outer Space, but I couldn't judge his decorations until he finished putting everything together. On October 1st, he started laying out all his new decorations. I made a rule years ago that no decorations would come up before October. Otherwise, we'd be a Halloween house all year long. When I got back home from work that day, he'd already finished the porch and front yard. Our house had been transformed into some kind of satanic church, with empty pews on the grass, a sacrificial slab in the center, and the goat demon ruling over it all. It wasn't the scariest display he'd ever made, but it was certainly the most unnerving. The fake red symbols on everything gave it a weird kind of authenticity, and even in the sunlight, the goat demon was genuinely creepy. I had mixed feelings, obviously, but I appreciated that my husband was really thinking outside of the box this year. I went inside to congratulate him on all his work, but he was too busy scurrying around the house to stop and talk to me. He had cleared out all of our furniture. I wasn't sure where he put it, and he'd drawn more of those symbols on all our walls. At the moment, he was laying out short stone columns, making the living room look like some unholy temple. I didn't like to bother Devin when he was in the zone like this, so I went outside to take a walk. Mostly, I was just curious what the neighbors thought. Normally, we received instant positive feedback. This time, all the neighbors ignored me. Their silence spoke volumes. Eventually, I ran into my neighbor Leanne, who was probably the most religious person in our block. She looked me right in the eyes and begged me to tear down our decorations. I told her that I would never do that to my husband. "He's planning something," Leanne said. "Look at the symbols." I told her she needed help and left. When I got back home, Devin had calmed down. He'd finished the living room and kitchen and would get to the rest tomorrow. I made him dinner, but since he cleared out the furniture, we had to sit on the floor and use one of his fake stone slabs for a table. He asked me what I thought, and I was honest with him. I told him that the neighbors didn't seem to appreciate this year's theme. "So what?" he said. Later that night, while Devin was in the shower, I took a photo of one of his decorations and did a reverse image search on Google. The symbol was Assyrian, and it represented blood. I did the same thing to two more symbols. One meant madness and one meant autumn. According to Google, all these symbols were found in the Last Star commune, that death cult in Oregon from a few years back. 40 people lived on that commune, stopping all communication with the outside world. When the authorities finally came to check them out, all 40 people were gone. All that was left were empty buildings and those same symbols. I was genuinely surprised that my husband had decided to use the symbols from a real-life tragedy. No wonder the neighbors were offended. I really didn't want to meddle with Devin's vision, but I had to talk to him. I pulled him aside and asked where he'd gotten the idea for his theme. I expected him to level with me, but he got really cagey and said that a little birdie told him how to decorate. I didn't press the issue. Clearly, he wasn't going to tell me. For the next week, he kept adding more to his display. Pretty soon, all our walls were covered with those symbols, even in our bedroom. It was driving me crazy. And worst of all, Devin didn't seem to be having any fun. He had turned manic, obsessively adding to the decorations without really enjoying himself. He barely even talked to me anymore. The neighbors avoided us both. Our decorations had made us into pariahs in the community. The only person who still talked to me was Leanne, but that was only to beg me to tear down the display. 3 days before Halloween, I heard Devin grunting outside our living room window. I went outside to see what he was doing. He had added metal spikes to the front yard. They jutted out of the lawn in different directions, making our yard look even more off-putting. "Please stop," I told him. "This has gone too far. No one likes these decorations. I definitely don't." "Not until Halloween night," he said. I couldn't accept that. I grabbed the metal pole out of his hands. He pulled it back. We struggled for a bit, the first real fight we've ever had. He was much stronger than me, though. I let go. I didn't want to fight my own husband. But he was pulling backward at the time, and when I let go, he stumbled back. His arms spun around him as he tried to maintain his balance, but it was too late. He fell right on top one of the new spikes. It skewered him right through the stomach. I screamed in horror. The police came very quickly after that. I assume one of our neighbors called them. They checked Devin's body, but he was already dead. Then they asked me a few questions, decided it was an accident, and left with the body. I was now all alone, surrounded by my dead husband's horrible markings. That was when Leanne approached. She gave me a big hug and told me that I was better off now. "You've been cleansed," she said. I didn't understand until that night, when I was looking through Devin's phone. The police hadn't taken that away. I looked through his messages and found a text conversation between Devin and Leanne. She was the one who sent them those symbols. It was her idea all along. But why? It made no sense. I charged out of the house and walked straight to Leanne's place down the street. She was sitting on her porch, acting like she expected me to come. "So, you found out," she said. Then she looked around to make sure no one could hear us. She whispered, "Long live the last star." I'm deathly allergic to peanuts. It's something I've had to deal with all my life. I always carry an EpiPen with me, and I only go to restaurants that I trust. It's an inconvenience for sure, but I've learned to live with it. It helped that my husband Daniel was so supportive. He did all the cooking in the house, and he always triple-checked everything I ate. I think my allergies were the main reason I hated Halloween so much. As a kid, I went trick-or-treating, but I never got to eat any of my candy. My allergies were so severe that even if a single Reese's peanut butter cup was in my bag, then all the candy near it was contaminated. My husband loved Halloween, though. It was his favorite time of year. He made sure to always buy me a giant bag of Tootsie Rolls, which of course didn't have any peanuts. It became sort of a tradition in our household, Daniel's yearly Tootsie Roll present. A few days before Halloween, I woke up in the middle of the night to find the rest of the bed empty. I could hear Daniel downstairs in the kitchen. I was a little curious. Daniel was the heaviest sleeper I knew. The only times he woke up at night were when he was sick. So I got out of bed and walked downstairs. Daniel didn't hear me come down. He was leaning over the kitchen counter spraying something. I walked a bit closer and could feel my throat start to constrict. I had to rush out of the room and grab my EpiPen, but not until after I saw exactly what Daniel was doing. He was spraying peanut oil onto this year's bag of Tootsie Rolls. I got back upstairs and injected myself. It took about a minute for me to be able to breathe properly again. Once I was back to normal, a horrible realization struck me. Daniel was trying to kill me. Thankfully, he didn't know that I'd caught him in the act. I could hear Daniel take a shower in the downstairs bathroom, probably to wash away all the peanut fumes. When he got back into bed, I kept my eyes closed and pretended to still be asleep. "Honey?" I heard him whisper. But when I didn't react, he fell asleep. All that night, my mind was restless. Why would Daniel do that? And more importantly, what should I do to protect myself? I decided to wait until morning and then take the bag of candy to the police. That had to be enough evidence of attempted murder, right? Once I made that decision, my brain calmed down enough for me to fall back asleep. The next morning, Daniel woke me up with breakfast in bed. He was acting really romantic, complimenting me on how naturally beautiful I looked in the morning. I told him I had a stomach ache and refused the breakfast. I didn't want to risk it. While Daniel got ready for work, I put on some gloves and grabbed the Tootsie Rolls from the cabinet, careful to hold the bag as far away from me as possible. I took it into my car and left. I was planning to take the evidence to the police, but as I drove, I pictured Daniel's smiling face. I thought about how kind he was acting this morning. The image made me angrier than I'd ever been. I was less than a minute away from the police station when I made a U-turn. I decided not to get the police involved. I was going to handle this situation myself. I hid the peanut-coated bag of Tootsie Rolls in the trunk and went to Walmart to buy an identical bag. Then I went back home and placed it exactly where the other had been. Then I found the spray can of peanut oil hidden under the sink and threw it in the trash, just in case. Daniel left for work, completely oblivious to the switch. I spent the rest of the day filled with both anger and nervousness. Deep down, I knew I should have gone to the authorities, and I still could. I had the evidence in my trunk, but in the end, I didn't. Daniel came home a bit earlier than usual, explaining that he wanted to savor our time together. He didn't realize how suspicious that sounded. Once again, he acted sweet and affectionate, which only made me angrier. While he sat on the couch watching TV, I went into the kitchen and came back with the Tootsie Roll bag. Daniel's eyes widened. "Those are for Halloween." "I know," I told him, "but I just had a craving. It's okay to eat a few, right?" He squirmed in his seat, trying to figure out what to say, until he eventually gave in. "Okay, why not?" I sat on the chair across from him, the candy bag in my lap. I pretended to cough. He watched nervously as I opened the bag and unwrapped my first piece. "We really should wait for Halloween," he tried one more time. I just smiled at him and tossed the candy into my mouth. I chewed it for a long time as I watched his reaction. "It tastes different," I lied. He didn't say anything. He was holding onto the sofa cushion so tightly that I could see the veins in his hands. He was waiting for me to start choking. So I gave him what he wanted. I bulged out my eyes and forced myself to cough. I'd had enough real allergy attacks in the past to know exactly what it would look like. "EpiPen!" I gasped out. As I faked my reaction, I paid close attention to my husband's face. It was frighteningly blank, with not an ounce of surprise. I twisted my body and reached toward him. "EpiPen!" I said again. He pulled the EpiPen out of his pocket. He held it up for me to see, but he didn't leave his seat. He was taunting me with it. "Why?" I croaked, holding my breath so that my face would turn red. He smiled, but there was nothing behind his eyes. "I hate you from every inch of my heart," he said. "But I love your money." That was all the explanation I needed. My husband, my soulmate, hated me. Perhaps he always had. With one final gasp, I pretended to die. I made my body go completely limp, and I flopped my tongue to the side. He didn't react for a while, and I worried that he saw through my acting. But then he got to his feet, let out a cold laugh, walked over and grabbed my feet. "Rest in peace, my love." He pulled me onto the floor and dragged me toward the back door. That was probably the hardest part of my roleplay, but thankfully we didn't have any stairs outside our door. It was a clean shot from the living room into the backyard. He pulled me onto the grass and left me there. I could have jumped up and run away, but curiosity forced me to stay perfectly still. With my eyes half opened, I saw Daniel return with a shovel. I felt a smile spread across my face, but he thankfully didn't notice. After that, I heard him digging a hole just a few feet away. I don't know how long I waited, perfectly still, but it must have been at least an hour. Finally, I heard a thunk as he dropped the shovel and climbed out of the hole. He was panting from the effort. I felt his hands once again grab my feet. Just as he was about to chuck me into the hole, I kicked him as hard as I could. He flew backwards, landing with a crunch. I stood up to get a better look. He was lying on the bottom of the hole, whimpering and cradling his freshly broken arm. The hole wasn't very deep, but it was deep enough for him to need both arms to pull himself up. "Get me out of here!" he screamed. "Sure," I said, "as soon as you tell me why you tried to kill me." "I already did," he whimpered. All he had was a broken arm, but he was acting like such a baby. It was for your money." "Thanks for confessing. That's all we needed to hear," I said. I looked at our 3 neighbors, who had run over as soon as they heard the screams. Daniel couldn't see them over the edge, but they heard everything. That's when I finally called the police.
My twin sister Regina started dating this hot guy named Trey. She showed me his photo, and he was honestly the most attractive man I'd ever seen. He was almost too handsome. They dated for a couple of months before I actually got to meet him. She talked about him all the time, though. When they finally agreed to come over to my place, it was right before Halloween. My sister and I had an annual pumpkin carving tradition, something we'd been doing since we were kids. I figured that would be the perfect opportunity to get to know Trey. When they arrived at my door, he was even more good-looking than I'd realized. My sister had really lucked out. Unfortunately, my opinion changed as soon as I got to know him. He seemed nice on the surface, but there was something devious about him. He made these really dark jokes, usually at my expense. Regina laughed at everything he said. Several times she told me to lighten up. She said that Trey had a dark sense of humor, but that was a good excuse for his rude behavior. Even worse, she accused me of being jealous. I'd just been dumped by my long-term boyfriend, Ben, so she thought I was being extra harsh to Trey because I secretly wanted him for myself. We carved our pumpkins in my kitchen, and for the first time ever, I wasn't enjoying the experience. I genuinely felt uncomfortable being around Trey. I was the last to finish carving my pumpkin. I'd made a pretty cool witch's face. Regina made a more traditional jack-o'-lantern. Then I saw Trey's pumpkin. He'd carved a face that looked exactly like me, except he added a bullet hole in my forehead. "What the hell?" I asked. Regina didn't see any problem with it. She laughed and said he did a good job. That was my breaking point. I told them that they should leave. They both acted surprised, like I was being too sensitive and too irrational, but they left anyway. They didn't take their jack-o'-lanterns. I didn't want those things in my house anymore, so I stuck them on the porch and I tried to forget about the whole thing. Regina called me the next day. I expected an apology, but instead I got a lecture. She defended Trey's dark humor, saying that it was just his personality. She mentioned my ex, Ben, and all the times that she had put up with his rude behavior without complaint. And she was right. Ben had been a jerk to her, but he never gave off psycho energy like Trey did. I ended up hanging up on her. I was too angry to continue the conversation. That night, I heard loud noises outside my front door. When I went out to check, all our jack-o'-lanterns had been smashed. I immediately knew that it was Trey trying to get back at me. I took a photo and I sent it to Regina. Her response? "Why did you do that?" She thought that I had smashed our pumpkins. She was so blind to her boyfriend's flaws that she refused to listen to reason. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next day, I came home from work to find my front yard covered with toilet paper. Worse, someone had thrown a rock through one of my windows. There was one word written on the rock in Sharpie marker. Bitch. This was more than just a dark sense of humor. This was harassment. I should have called the police then and there, but instead, I called Regina. Once again, she refused to believe me. I asked where Trey was that day, and she said he was at work. Likely story. I covered up the broken window and I stayed home for the rest of the night, too angry to go anywhere. Just after sunset, I saw Trey wandering around the back of my house. It was too dark to see clearly, but I knew it was him. It had to be. He was dressed all in black so he could blend into the shadows. He had a club or baseball bat in his hand. Panicked, I locked myself in my bedroom and called the police. It was the weekend before Halloween, so I guess the police were having a busy night. They said they'd send someone down as soon as possible. I couldn't wait that long. I quietly snuck down to my garage, got in my car, and sped out of there. If Regina wouldn't listen to me over the phone, I'd have to talk to her face to face. When I arrived at her house, Trey wasn't there. Regina let me in, but she seemed a little suspicious. We sat together, and I told her everything. I begged her to believe me. And to her credit, she seemed to genuinely consider what I was saying. She asked, "Are you sure it was Trey that you saw sneaking around your house?" Well, honestly, it was too dark to be 100% certain, but who else could it have been? "Yes," I said. Finally, Regina believed me. Trey was dangerous. She admitted that he'd left their house to go run some errands right before I saw him in my yard. She said that he'd been gone a lot recently, and he never told her where he'd been. Then she started to cry, saying that she thought he was the one. "How could I have been so stupid?" she wailed. I tried to reassure her. We all have blind spots when it comes to the men we date. I ignored a lot of shady stuff with my ex Ben before I'd finally had enough. That made her feel a little better, but we still didn't know what to do about Trey. If he truly was this unhinged, then she'd have to be very careful with what we did next. We started making a plan. But before we got anywhere, the front door opened and Trey walked inside. He was hiding something behind his back, probably that same baseball bat. He was surprised to see me, and he asked Regina if he could talk to her in private.
"No!"
she screamed at him.
"Get out of my house!"
So much for dealing with him carefully. "What's going on?" he asked, pretending to be confused. Then he glared at me, assuming that I'd somehow turned his girlfriend against him. "You heard her," I said. "Go!" He didn't. He walked inside, begging us to sit down and hear him out. I could tell that Regina was giving in, and I didn't want him to manipulate her again. So I grabbed her wrist, and together we ran up the stairs. He chased after us, screaming, "Wait! Wait!" He took the stairs 2 at a time, catching up to us pretty quickly. He still had one hand behind his back, but the other reached for Regina. "Just listen!"
"You're crazy!"
I screamed at him before Regina could respond. "Where were you tonight?" He refused to answer. For a long moment, Regina looked back and forth between me and Trey, trying to figure out who to trust. She gave me a silent nod, and then told her boyfriend, "Get away from me!" He had his hand on her shoulder, so she pulled back. And that's when Trey lost his balance. That's when he fell. 1 second, he was at the top of the stairs, standing tall, and the next moment, he was toppling down the stairs, grunting in pain. When his body struck the floor, he was motionless, and the objects behind his back fell to the side. It was a tiny box with an engagement ring inside. That's why he'd been sneaking out. He was planning to propose. Horrified, both Regina and I walked down the stairs and stood over his body. Regina checked his pulse, but we both knew it was useless. His neck was broken. My phone rang in my pocket, the noise startling me. It was the police. They had just arrived at my house and found the intruder. It was my ex-boyfriend, Ben. "What?" I asked. The officer spoke very calmly. He said that Ben admitted to the harassment. He wanted to scare me enough so that I'd take him back. "But don't worry, ma'am, we're taking him into custody. He won't harm you ever again." I looked up at my sister. I could tell by her expression that she had heard everything. "I'm so sorry," I told her. That was the last time I ever saw my sister. She refuses to talk to me anymore. And I don't blame her. She'd found the love of her life, and now he was dead. She thought I didn't know. She thought she could fool me like the rest of the world, hiding behind her carefully curated posts, her polished image. But I saw through it. I always see through the lies. I've lived in this building for almost a decade, seen influencers come and go, flashing their fake lives in front of the camera, pretending everything's perfect. But she was different. There was something darker in her, lurking just beneath the surface. And I caught it. I knew right away. The night Zara West died, I saw her. No one else was around. Just me, sitting in my apartment, watching through the window like I always do. Zara was coming down the stairwell. And then there was her, the rising Instagram star, the golden girl of the moment, following close behind. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw the push. Saw the way Zara's head smacked against the concrete steps, the way her body crumpled. She didn't get back up. The girl, her name was Sophie, looked panicked. She crouched over Zara for a moment, then ran. It was sloppy, impulsive. I almost laughed at how easy it would be to ruin her. But why expose her right away when I could have a little fun first? I waited a few weeks, long enough for the police investigation to stall, long enough for Sophie to think that she'd gotten away with murder. Then I left the first note under her door. I know what you did. It was simple, but effective. She didn't know who I was yet. Didn't realize it was me, her harmless neighbor, the man who always seemed to be in the background. I watched her read it through my peephole, her face turning pale, her hands trembling. She was afraid, just like I wanted. The next few days, I upped the game. Another note, more explicit this time. I saw you push her. Her panic was delicious. She was unraveling, and I hadn't even begun. I knocked on her door that night. The look on her face when she opened it, it was priceless. I could practically taste the fear. You've got a real problem on your hands, I said casually, pretending this was all so simple, so businesslike. Lucky for you, I can be discreet. She didn't even argue. Didn't ask how much money I wanted. No, I wasn't after cash. That would have been boring. I wanted something more personal. Something that would remind her week after week who really held the power. You'll bring me something of yours, I told her, leaning in close enough to smell her perfume. Something intimate. Every week. I saw the disgust in her eyes, but she nodded. She didn't have a choice. She was mine now. The weeks went by, and she complied like clockwork. Each time she handed over her expensive lingerie, I could see the humiliation written all over her face. It was beautiful. She was a star to her millions of followers, but to me, she was just a scared little girl with blood on her hands. But of course, it wasn't enough. It never is. Once you have control over someone, once you taste that power, you want more. I started asking for more expensive pieces, more frequent deliveries. Watching her squirm under my demands, it was intoxicating. I should have known she'd try something eventually, that she wouldn't just keep handing over her dignity forever. But I underestimated her desperation. Last night, she knocked on my door, like she always did, holding the latest piece. I could see it in her eyes. Something was different. But I took the lingerie from her, the soft lace slipping through my fingers. It felt lighter than usual, like it had been handled too carefully. You've been very obedient, I said, grinning as I always did. I was about to close the door when she spoke, her voice too steady, too calm. I do what I have to. There was something in her tone, something cold. She turned to leave, but I didn't close the door. I stood there, watching her walk back to her apartment, feeling the fabric between my fingers. That's when I smelled it. The faintest hint of something metallic, something off. I wasn't stupid. I had been in the military once, years before. I knew what poison smelled like. A laugh bubbled up in my throat. Clever girl. She had finally decided to fight back. I wondered how long she'd been planning this, how many sleepless nights she'd spent trying to figure out how to get rid of me. I tossed the lingerie aside and pulled on a pair of gloves, examining it more closely. The seams were too neat, but the poison had been worked in somewhere. Maybe it was soaked into the lace, or maybe it was smeared along the edges. Either way, if I had worn it, if I had let it touch my skin, I'd have been dead within hours. I stood there in my small, dimly lit apartment thinking about what to do next. I could go to the police, turn her in for attempted murder, but where would be the fun in that? No, I wasn't done with Sophie yet. This morning, I slipped a final note under her door. Nice try, but you'll have to do better than that. I imagined her reading it, her face going pale again, her heart sinking as she realized she hadn't won. She'd never win, not against me. I know everything about her. I know her routine, her brand, her secrets. She thinks she's clever, but I'm always 2 steps ahead. And now she's made her move, so I'll make mine. Maybe I'll stop asking for lingerie. Maybe next time I'll ask for something more. Something she can't replace. Her fame, her fortune, it all belongs to me now. She'll never know when I'll strike next. She's trapped, forever dancing on the strings I pull. And there's nothing she can do to cut herself free. My decision to move to Helensville was wholly logical. I had done my research of the place. Helensville was nestled smack in the middle of hills and whispering woods. The air in Helensville carried a hint of sweet honeysuckle, wafting in gentle breezes that never ceased. It was perfection at first impression, and I could not imagine that there was such a place for me in a world like this. The streets in the neighborhood were wide macadam tarred, lined with trees and greenery that formed natural canopies from the sunlight. The buildings were modern constructions, with hints of an era in the last century when materials seemed to be of better quality and lasted longer. The craftsmanship was evident in the uniqueness of each home. Helensville had one bookstore, and it was close to the market square. The cafes, however, featured more, even though patrons were infrequent to dining out. I took regular evening strolls and stopped at the cafes and the bookstore often when I moved to Helensville, but it quickly got boring. The people were vibrant, but they were not present. The tranquility was a haven, a sanctuary that felt compelled to nurture for as long as they could. It was this that first informed my unease about the place. My life had become too routine for my liking, because back in the city from where I had moved to Helensville, there was always the element of spontaneity. The idea that anything could happen was exciting. It was one of the simple joys of life that I had overlooked until I did not have it. I spoke to one of the hosts at a cafe I frequented, and he told me about Craigslist and how I could make friends in Helensville through Craigslist easily. He mentioned that Helensville had a naturally snobbish society, and the only way people got to know each other was by finding hobbies that they shared amongst themselves. I thanked him for his suggestion, and that same evening, I was on Craigslist to find friends. It was not long before I found a small group that had hiking as a connecting hobby. The head of the group was a bloke named Tom. Tom was a chatter, charismatic and friendly as he was. He seemed a simple character, and we established some rapport between ourselves in a matter of hours when he revealed to me that I was just in luck, and he would be going on a hiking expedition into the woods in a matter of days. He asked me to join, and I, sensing no danger in his request, obliged him. I was going to make friends at last, it seemed, and I made plans towards having a good first impression. On the day of the hike, I was prepared for any eventuality because I was of the idea that we could encounter a bear or any beast in the woods, and it would be good to have some defense. I kept the thought to myself to not appear strange to the others, who would not be taken to the fact that I had brought a gun to the expedition. It was a nice surprise to finally meet Tom in person, who was effusive and just as charming. He was a man in his 30s, even though he had a noticeable stomach pouch. He was bald, but hairy on his arms and legs. Neatly shaven, Tom looked like every other regular person in Helensville. He complimented my outfit and said he wished he had a hiking backpack like mine for himself. I humbly laughed it off and told him it was easy to get as I'd gotten it at the store. "We will be very good friends, Cameron," he said to me, and reached his hands out for a handshake. The first handshake I'd gotten in weeks. I shook his hands with no fear at all. and I suspect at this point I let a bit of my guard down. There was nothing about Tom that betrayed his intention. He said we would have to wait on another hiking member resident in Helensville before we would go. In 10 minutes, we were joined by another hiking member, and then it was time for us to leave. "I guess we have the main trail maps?" Tom said to us. I nodded and turned sideways to see the other member also nodding affirmatively. "But to hell with a map, eh? You want to see something cool?" "You always know the coolest spots, Tom," the other member said, and they both giggled. So I giggled because it would be strange to not do so. "Trust me, it's nothing like you've ever seen, Dominic," Tom said to him in camaraderie. "Y'all go on these expeditions together often?" I quizzed. They nodded, and Tom turned around to lead the way down the trail. We walked down the trail for a while, and Tom ranted about the secret spot he was taking us to and how beautiful it was to view the hills from up there. Before I could reconcile all of it, Tom had taken the other route, and we were headed in a direction that only he knew. I marched with caution, carefully treading as I had no idea what could be in the bushy parts of the trail. We were 20 minutes away from the main trail when the most potent danger, one which I had not envisaged but prepared for anyway, appeared. Tom's true intentions. "Take off your watch," Tom said to me as he flashed a knife at me once he sensed the sudden confusion in my appearance. All of the common cues of dangers which I had missed earlier rushed to my mind, and I was dizzy from the thought of it. "Why are you doing this to me?" I asked, and before I could take the watch off my hands, Dominic, the other hiking member, revealed himself to be part of the plan, snatching the watch from my wrist forcefully. "It's a robbery, my dumb friend. We don't live in your posh estate, so you'll never find us." Dominic added to my terror when he showed off a blade so sharp it refracted sunlight. The sight of such a blade and the menace in both their eyes had me visibly shaken, but I tried to maintain my calm. It was obvious that they would do me harm in an instant if I moved in a way that they did not like. "Give us all your valuables and you may live," Tom muttered and poked his knife at me. The knife cut my thick cargo vest, and he sliced it to show me he was not joking. I was scared for my life, and I watched it flash before my eyes as I asked them to allow me to take off my bag and bring out what was valuable. The bait on their curiosity worked, and they allowed it. So I ransacked my bag in the way that I knew I had arranged all of my stuff. My heart was beating so fast in utter dread because if they knew what I was doing, they would not hesitate to finish me off. Thankfully, they had no clue until I brought the gun out to turn the tide. "Get down on your knees!" I hollered, to their shock, directing Dominic to Tom. They obeyed at the sight of my weapon. "I'm calling the cops!" They remained on their knees until the cops found us, because even though I was scared as hell out there, it was obvious to me, as it was to them, that I would not hesitate to pull the trigger. They were arrested, and I found my way back to civilization, with a learnt lesson to never trust people so easily.
For the last 2 years, I've worked as a caregiver for an elderly woman named Lois. She had dementia, and it was progressing fast. Her son Aaron lived nearby, and he helped out as much as he could, but she needed someone to watch her at all times. When I started, I was her full-time caregiver, and I thought I was doing a good job. Lois didn't always remember my name, but she seemed comfortable with me. About a year into the job, Aaron pulled me aside and told me that he was cutting my hours. He said that I wasn't giving her enough attention, but I figured the real reason was that he wanted someone cheaper. Instead of firing me, he kept me on as the nighttime caregiver and hired a much younger girl named Janet to work during the daytime. This angered me a lot. This new girl was very sweet, though, so I had no ill will toward her. On October 1st, Janet had decorated the whole house for Halloween. She hung fake ghosts from the ceiling and added pumpkins and black cats everywhere. I thought this was a terrible idea. Patients with dementia need order in their lives, and any changes to their surroundings could trigger another episode. I tried to tell this to Janet, but she refused to listen. She didn't care that Lois was visibly agitated by the decorations. When Janet left, Lois was sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth and babbling about how the ghosts were coming for her. I knew this was going to be a long night. I sat with her for a bit, singing her favorite song to help calm her down. It worked for a while, but then she noticed the ghosts again and started to freak out. I was getting her dinner ready at the time. By the time I rushed out to see if she was okay, she had already raced out of the house and into the empty street. I couldn't find her anywhere. Then I saw a movement behind the trees and knew that she'd wandered into the park. It was a dangerous place at night, especially for a poor old woman who didn't understand her surroundings. Her son Aaron's house was next door, so I went over and asked him to help me find her. He seemed angry at me, but I didn't have time to explain that this wasn't my fault. But it was all because of Janet and her stupid decorations. To speed up the search, Aaron and I split up. We were both shouting her name. I circled around the far side of the park, but I didn't see any sign of Lois. In the distance, I heard Aaron shout his mom's name one last time, and then he went completely silent. I also heard a loud thud. Expecting the worst, I cut through the middle of the park. Lois was standing by herself, swaying from side to side. Aaron was lying at her feet, blood dripping out of his mouth. Next to his body was a large, bloody stick. I ran over to Lois and held her shoulders, trying to get her to calm down. "The ghost killed him," she muttered over and over. It didn't take a genius to figure out what had happened. Lois, in her manic state, had bludgeoned her own son to death, and rather than accept what had happened, her brain conjured up visions of ghosts. I felt terrible for her. I sang softly into her ear until she stopped shaking, and then I guided her back to the house. Once I got her into bed, I called the police. Later that night, her doctor picked her up for examinations at the psychiatric hospital. She wasn't technically committed, but she obviously wasn't allowed to leave. The police came for Aaron's body, and after I gave them my statement, I went back home. I felt so sorry for Lois, but I also felt sorry for myself. I was out of a job. The next morning, I went back to Lois's house to pick up my belongings. It was empty, of course. I packed up my things, mostly books and medical equipment, and headed out. But as I was carrying my box of stuff, I noticed something white sticking out of the trash can. It wasn't there last night. It was a ghost costume. Janet's ghost costume. I'd seen pictures of her wearing it the year before. Something fishy was going on. Before I could figure out what, someone surprised me from behind and bashed me on the back of the head. When I woke up, I was down in the basement. My head throbbed. There were plastic pumpkins and fake cobwebs on the floor around me. Janet stood in the doorway, smiling down at me. She had one hand behind her back. "It's about time you woke up." She gleefully explained that she'd been sleeping with Aaron for months. That's how she got this job. He'd called things off the day before, and she couldn't accept that. So she devised this elaborate plan to murder him and frame Lois. "And now you caught me," she said. "I'm going to burn the house down with you in it. No offense." Still smiling, she showed me what she had been hiding behind her back. A glass bottle filled with gasoline and a rag sticking out of the top. It was a Molotov cocktail. She pulled out a lighter and lit the rag. She raised the bottle over her head, but before she could throw it, I grabbed a plastic pumpkin and chucked it at her. She lost her grip on the bottle and it fell at her feet. Her dress instantly caught on fire. Soon, the fire had spread over her entire body. As she wailed in pain, I ran past her and out the door. The firemen came just in time to save Lois's house. Janet wasn't as lucky. A month later, Lois was back home and I was once again her only caretaker.
Michelle was the light of my life. I still see her smile sometimes when I close my eyes between these oppressive walls. The rank smell of sweat and piss do not filter into that beautiful place where my sister is. I try to smile back at her sometimes, but I cannot. My world has gone bleak since she was taken from me, and even laughter was too bright a light to filter into my soul. It had been us, Michelle and I, against the world since our parents had passed. She was the calmest soul anyone could meet, and she did not trouble anyone. Yet that foul bastard had run the red light, crushing Michelle against the wall so badly that I could not recognize the only family I had in the world. Driving under the influence. He was drunk, hit and run, unintentional manslaughter. All those many words that did not serve Michelle or I the justice that we truly deserved. I could not forgive it. I could not forgive myself either. Not when he got a lenient sentence that saw him out of jail in a matter of years, while I got to live in the horror of that dreadful night, seething with rage and sorrow. The emptiness yawned at me and overwhelmed me every time it did, until I knew I had to do something about it. I took a job at the construction site near the Dunkin' Donuts where I knew he would eat sometimes, and I staked it every evening with the hope that one day I would meet him and still be angry enough to feed him the same pain he had at my feast. My routine was simple after my shift at the site. 3 plain donuts, 3 pies, and 1 extra-large Sprite soda. I turned to nursing my coffee and donuts after a long day as a plumber at the site, sitting in the punishing silence as other people would come in and leave, and no sign of the drunk driver. On some days, I was hardly noticed, as a threat. The staff, regarding me as a new regular that worked at the construction firm, did their best to not draw attention to me while I ate, and I appreciated it for all of the 3 weeks that I staked there. On some other days, the staff would be chatty, cautious of my presence, sitting in the corner and throwing humor about it as though to get me into a lighter mood. I appreciated it, but I was in so much pain that Dunkin' Donuts entertainment and food was not enough color for me. The evening my stalking paid off, the weather was particularly gloomy and cold, as though the elements mourned my actions. The weight of unfulfilled vengeance hung on my shoulders as I grabbed a slice of my donut in a mouthful. My eyes had drifted to the door, as it always did, scanning for his presence, and I had not expected him to stagger into the cafe as he did, and I must confess that my heart did skip a beat. He was in the company of friends, obviously drunk, and maintained that brash demeanor that riled me up so badly, causing the donut in my mouth to immediately go dry. I sat there in terrific rage, watching him burst into hearty conversation with his friends that he came in with. I wondered how he could continue to live his life lacking so much remorse for my sister's life which he had taken from me. My fingers trembled as I watched him, numbed the rest of the occurrences around. I simply knew he was being loud, and security pulled him aside, helping him up from the ground as he stumbled, and they held him outside. His friends promised to get what they needed, and all he had to do was wait for them in the car. My heart pounded in my chest, and my vision narrowed to him as he turned around with a slow march to the car. I could not let such a moment pass me by without doing something about it. I jumped on my feet and walked briskly after him to go where the cars were parked. I bumbled in my stride, but I tried to maintain some composure, even in my anger. "Jerry!" I called him once I was within earshot. He turned around and stared at me briefly, determining that I was not worth his time. He continued to walk away. I called him again. "What, pal? Who the hell are you?" He belched, the stench of alcohol covering the distance between us. You're Jerry?" My voice broke. I saw his eyes dance as he tried to search for my face in his mind. "I don't got no time for games. I'm going home." With that, he flicked his key out of his pocket. Grief blinded me, and I could not let what he had done to Michelle happen to someone else. "You won't take another life," I said to him, and immediately I drew out a pocket knife that I always kept on me. Jerry turned around, and the look of horror that flashed across his face was like one who had seen the devil himself. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words had barely formed in his mouth when I jabbed my blade into his gut, dragging it across his belly. He grabbed my shirt tightly and rasped in desperate terror, needing to shake me off as he bled.
Please, don't kill me. I'm no killer,
he cried, sober from his alcohol when he was faced with the present manifestation of death. I knew I could not stop, even though I was just as scared and confused as him. I pulled the blade out and stabbed him in the chest 3 times, puncturing his heart. There's only one killer between us, I said to him, the terror in his eyes affecting me.
Mother,
he cussed at me. Michelle, remember her? I said. And immediately I saw him reconcile with his dying breath that he indeed deserved his fate.
I'm sorry. Please, save me,
he clucked, choking. Apologies and pleas felt like salt on an open wound. It filled me with an intense annoyance of him because Michelle never got to beg for her life when he ended her life. His eyes were in so much despair for his fate. None of his bravado and arrogance remained. His hands trembled until they suddenly went stiff. It was only then that I moved on from him, realizing what I had done. I was crippled with the dread of such an irrevocable horror that came with a twisted sense of closure. It was final. I had done it for Michelle, and my sister could now rest easy knowing I had given her justice at the cost of my own freedom. I made no attempt to flee, and I just sat beside the body as the sirens approached. I was handcuffed, and I've been incarcerated for that one horrifying night of release. I accept my fate with calm resignation.
My fiancé Bert and I agreed to host our big family reunion. He invited every relative he had to our humble house for a barbecue. His brother usually hosted the yearly reunion, but this year, Bert volunteered our house. I wish he'd told me beforehand, because he knew I'd be the one responsible for everything besides the barbecuing itself. By the time he told me, he'd already sent out all the invitations. I couldn't say no. So on the morning of our big event, we drove to Costco to load up on food and snacks. Bert hated Costco. He hated grocery shopping of any kind, but because Costco was such a long drive away, and because I tended to take my time there, he almost never went with me. He much preferred to stay at home, where he could do all his online work in peace. But this time, I forced him to come with me. We were shopping for his relatives, after all. While I picked out all the food, including the meat he was going to barbecue, Bert wandered around the rest of the store looking for free samples. We split up as soon as we entered, and for the next half hour or so, I didn't see him anywhere. Once I was finally done, I tried to find him. I called his phone. No answer. I asked the other shoppers. They had no idea who he was. I could still see our car through the window, so I knew he hadn't left. He was just being an idiot again. I was angry. We were there shopping for his family, not mine, and he couldn't even bother to stay put while I did all the work. I got in line, figuring he'd find me there, but the cashier was scanning my stuff and he still hadn't come back. The lady asked me what was wrong, and I told her about my missing fiancé. She seemed sympathetic, and there wasn't anyone behind me in line, so I pulled out my phone to show her a photo. "Have you seen him?" I asked. She immediately flinched. Her expression had gone from pleasant to frozen in less than a second. "No," she mumbled. "Never seen him before." Obviously, she was lying. She knew what happened to him, and she wouldn't tell me. I gave up trying to ask, paid for the groceries, and left. I dropped all the groceries into our car, but instead of driving away, I walked back inside. I noticed that the cashier I'd talked to was heading toward the back of the store. I followed her. She was in a hurry, which was probably why she didn't notice me. I watched her walk through a door in the far back corner of the store, behind the snack foods. The door slammed shut behind her, but I was able to see into the room for just a split second. I saw my fiancé. He was duct taped to the wall. Tape also covered his mouth, but I could still hear him grunting for help. And then the door closed. I stood there for a while, trying to process what I'd just seen. Then, once I convinced myself that I wasn't imagining things, I pushed open the door and charged inside. The cashier was standing in front of Bert, while another woman, a cashier I didn't recognize, was in the corner of the room, next to a tray of paintbrushes and bottles of black liquid. Both women looked surprised at my arrival. Bert screamed through the tape across his mouth, only managing a desperate, muffled grunt. "What the hell are you doing to my fiancé?" I asked. There was an umbrella leaning against the wall behind me, so I picked it up, just in case I needed a weapon to fight off these psychos. "He's a bad man," the first woman said, casually sliding her fingertips across his cheek. "He brought this on himself." The other woman, the one by the paintbrushes, asked me, "You have no idea what he's done, do you?" She stepped forward, holding out her phone. She wanted me to read something. "Let him go!" I demanded. I knew my fiancé was lazy and often annoying, but he was still a good person. Whatever he'd done in the past couldn't possibly justify a kidnapping. I raised the umbrella, ready to fight them off, but the woman didn't flinch. She just kept her phone extended, waiting for my curiosity to force me to look. And she was right. I grabbed the phone from her hand. Bert tried to scream through the duct tape. He didn't want me to see what was on that phone. I won't get into the specifics, but what I saw on her phone were dozens of screenshots of text messages and Facebook comments from Bert. His messages weren't just mean, they were threatening and racist and disgusting. "There's more on my phone," the other woman added. "Would you like to see those too?" I turned toward Bert, who had his head lowered and his eyes closed. "Did you write this?" His expression told me everything I needed to know. All this time, Bert had been an internet troll. He spent hours every night on his computer. I thought he was just doing work, but he was obviously using that time to threaten strangers in the most disgusting way possible. I gave the woman back her phone. I'd seen all I needed to see. "How long has he been messaging you?" She raised 3 fingers. 3 years? I asked. She nodded. The other woman said, "Just 1 year for me. He became obsessed with me while you two were shopping here last Christmas." "Is that true?" I asked Bert. I needed his answer. He nodded, looking both scared and broken. The 2 women waited for me to say something, but I could tell that they meant me no harm. All they cared about was teaching Bert a lesson. And who was I to stop them? "Carry on," I said. "Bert, come out to the car when you're done." And with that, I left them there and waited in the parking lot. 20 minutes later, he limped out of the store and joined me at the car. There were fiery burn marks across his face and arms. Whatever black liquid that had painted across his skin must have been corrosive or acidic. He looked like he was in terrible pain. He had enough strength to climb into the car and mumble one word: "Hospital." So I drove him straight to the hospital and dropped him off. He wanted me to wait for him there, but I still had all our groceries in the car, and his family was supposed to come over soon. So I left him there, went home, and got everything ready for the party. When his family came, I told them that Bert was recovering from an accident. They didn't ask any follow-up questions. And honestly, without Bert there, I had a surprisingly good time with his family. After a while, I forgot all about him. A week later, Bert was released from the hospital. He still has a few more skin grafts scheduled for next year, though. I asked him if he was going to tell the police what happened, but he refused. He knew that if he pushed the issue, all of his cyberbullying would get exposed, so I guess he'll just have to live with all his scars. Oh, and I called off the engagement.
I was struggling with the luggage, I admit it. The suitcases weren't even that heavy, but the combination of jet lag and nerves made them feel like lead. As I tried to drag them up the plush-carpeted staircase, I could feel the sweat gathering on my forehead, trickling down the back of my neck. My shirt clung to my skin in a way that made me feel both embarrassed and frustrated. "Stop dawdling and get that luggage up the stairs," my wife, Emily, called over her shoulder with a sigh. She didn't even look at me when she said it, her voice laced with exasperation. I'd only been married to her for a few weeks, but it already felt like I was failing her. Every look she gave me was colder than the last. Why had I let myself believe this could work? "Sorry, they're very heavy," I managed between breaths. I felt like an idiot. Other guests glanced at me with pity, but none of that stung as much as the dismissive way Emily looked at me. This was supposed to be our honeymoon, but it felt like a test I was already flunking. Well, before I could gather my strength to haul the bags the rest of the way, a voice cut through the awkward tension. "Would you like some help there, sir?" I turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man, looking like he stepped out of some magazine ad, the kind of man who made someone like me feel smaller. "We can't keep that lovely lady waiting all day, can we?" he added, with a wink in Emily's direction. I hated him instantly. "I can manage," I said quickly, trying to ignore the way Emily was practically glowing at the stranger. But my arms were aching and I was losing grip on the bags. Emily rolled her eyes, making no attempt to hide her frustration. "Honestly, Jack, let the nice man help you," she said, flicking her hair back and offering him a flirtatious smile. I felt my chest tighten, but what could I do? The man, Damien, as he later introduced himself, scooped up the suitcases like they weighed nothing and flashed Emily another charming grin. I trailed behind them, feeling like an extra in my own life. By the time I got to our honeymoon suite, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. Emily didn't waste time before flouncing off to the pool, leaving me to wallow in my misery. "I'll be back soon, darling," she had called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I knew where she was really going, to flirt with Damien by the pool. I lay in bed, too tired to even be angry, just hurt. Maybe she never wanted me. Maybe she had only married me out of some misguided pressure from her family. They loved me, but she barely tolerated me. I tried to close my eyes, convincing myself I'd feel better after a nap. That's when I felt it. Something crawling under my shirt, skittering across my skin. I sat up, startled, and slapped at it instinctively. My hand came away with blood and a stinging sensation on my ribs. Lifting my shirt, I saw the bite. A nasty red welt already forming, yellow pus seeping out of it. It reeked, and the skin around it felt hot. Whatever had bitten me wasn't normal. I swore under my breath. Of course, this was my honeymoon, after all, the one place where things could only go from bad to worse. I lay back down, hoping the pain would fade. But it didn't. Instead, I felt a strange, tingling sensation spread through my body. The world around me began to blur, and I realized with growing panic that I was losing consciousness. My last thought before everything went dark was that Emily would probably be happy if I never woke up. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, the room was dark. My vision was hazy, and for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. But then I realized that something was different. The pain was gone. The welt had vanished. I sat up in bed, feeling oddly energized, more alive than I had in years. My skin felt strange, though. Cooler, tougher, as if it had thickened overnight. And then I noticed it. Something moving beneath the surface of my skin. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, but no. Something was definitely crawling just beneath my flesh, wriggling and shifting in an unnerving dance. Panic surged through me. But then, as if by instinct, I willed it to stop. And it did. What the hell had bitten me? The next day, I watched Emily from a distance. She was down by the pool again, giggling with Damien, pretending like I didn't exist. I felt the anger building in my chest, but it wasn't the usual helpless rage. No, this time, I had power. I could feel it, crawling just beneath my skin, waiting to be unleashed. I followed them, staying in the shadows as Emily and Damien slipped away to a secluded spot behind the hotel. The way they laughed, the way he touched her arm, something inside me snapped. I felt my heart pounding, but not with jealousy. No, it was something colder, darker, a sense of finality. The game was over. I wasn't here to plead for her attention anymore. I wasn't here to fight Damien, to throw a punch and storm off like some foolish, jealous husband. I was here to finish it. They didn't even notice me at first. Emily was all smiles, her fingers grazing Damien's arm like she had forgotten I existed. I let them have their moment, knowing full well it was their last. As I stepped forward, Emily finally caught sight of me. Her face twisted with annoyance, as if I was interrupting some private fantasy she didn't want to be torn from. "Jack, what are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice carrying the sharpness of someone who no longer cared to hide their disdain. Damien looked me over, sizing me up with that smug smirk he always wore, the one that told me he thought he'd won. "Hey man, relax," he said, flashing me a patronizing grin. "We were just talking." I didn't respond. I just stared at them, my blood simmering beneath the surface. There was a time when I would have yelled, thrown a tantrum, maybe even tried to swing at Damien just to feel like I was doing something. But not now. This was different. I was done playing the fool. "I don't have anything to say," I said quietly, my voice steady. "You'll see soon enough." Without waiting for their response, I turned and walked away. They wouldn't understand what I meant. Not yet, but they would, soon. When I got back to the room, Emily still hadn't followed. I didn't care. I had something more important to deal with. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I pulled out her phone, which she had carelessly left on the dresser. My hands shook slightly as I scrolled through it. Not because I was nervous, because I already knew what I'd find. I just needed to see it with my own eyes. And there it was. Photos. Private, intimate ones. Emily and Damien, locked in embraces that she'd never given me. Their messages were wild. A running commentary of their secret affair, full of dirty stuff. The way they talked about me, like I was nothing. Like I was some pathetic obstacle in their way. My chest tightened, and for a brief moment I thought I might be having a heart attack. I felt the room spin, my vision blur. But I steadied myself. I couldn't lose it now. Not yet. The rage that surged inside me wasn't the kind that made you scream or punch walls. It was the kind that made you cold, calculating. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply opened her photo gallery, selected the worst of the images so private that they would ruin her and Damien in ways I could barely comprehend, and uploaded them to her social media accounts. Every platform she had, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, one by one I posted the pictures. No caption, no explanation, Just the raw, ugly truth for the world to see. As the notifications started pouring in, I could almost picture the chaos unfolding. Her friends, her family, her colleagues, every single person who had thought Emily was this perfect, untouchable woman would now see her for what she really was. And Damien? He wasn't going to walk away clean either. By the time Emily came back to the room, her face flushed from sun and flirtation, it was already too late. She hadn't checked her phone yet. She had no idea what I'd done. But when she saw me sitting there, calm and collected, something in her expression shifted. Maybe she sensed it, the quiet finality in my demeanor. "Jack, what's going on?" she asked, her tone a mix of irritation and uncertainty. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked to the door. Before leaving, I glanced back at her, at the woman I had once thought I loved, the woman who had destroyed me without a second thought. "You'll figure it out soon enough," I said, my voice cold, almost distant. And then I left. As I walked through the hotel lobby, I could feel my phone vibrating in my pocket, the messages coming in one after another. Friends asking if I was okay. Family concerned. I ignored them all. I didn't need their sympathy. I didn't need anything from anyone anymore. I had already won. By the time Emily realized what had happened, by the time she tried to pick up the pieces of her shattered reputation, it would be too late. The damage was done. And for the first time in months, I felt free. I had taken everything from her with just a few clicks. And the best part? No one could ever accuse me of laying a hand on her. My revenge was clean, precise, and irreversible. I didn't need to see the aftermath to know that her life, and Damien's, would never be the same again. I had made sure of that.
Two months ago, my brother Nicholas went missing. He left for work one day and never came home. The police found his car in a ditch 3 days later, but no one ever found his body. I knew right away that he'd been murdered. I just had a feeling in my gut. But my sister Kate, the baby of the family, always insisted that he was still out there. I didn't have the heart to tell her that he was gone forever. One day she'd realize it herself. On the weekend before Halloween, we both got invited to a house party just outside of town. I wasn't in the mood for it, but Kate insisted that I come along. She said it would be a nice way to honor Nicholas, because Halloween was his favorite holiday. I wore normal clothes and cat ears, which was barely a costume. Kate dressed like a nun. When we arrived at the party, it was already in full swing. There must have been dozens of people inside. Just as we were about to enter, Kate noticed someone standing in the distance. He was wearing a full-body skeleton costume, the exact same skeleton costume that Nicholas wore every Halloween. I thought it was just a coincidence, but Kate swore that it was him. She called out to the man. "Nicholas, is that you?" He glanced back at us and then started to run into the woods behind the house. Kate immediately chased after him. "Wait!" I screamed, but she had already disappeared into the trees. I couldn't let her go in there alone. Who knows who that masked man really was, or how dangerous he really was. I had to catch up to them. The woods were extremely dark, and aside from the party music in the distance, everything was very, very quiet. I saw movement up ahead. Kate was rounding a corner. I couldn't see the other guy. When I finally caught up with her, she was standing in front of an empty cabin. Its windows were boarded up, and it looked like no one had lived there for a long, long time. "He went inside," Kate whispered to me. "I know it's Nicholas." I begged her to go back with me. We shouldn't enter a place like this, not in the middle of the night. Not without backup. She wouldn't listen. She took my hand and started pulling me toward the door. I knew there was nothing I could say to stop her, so I went along. The inside of the cabin was lit with candles. Kate hurried through the bare living room and into the dark hallway just beyond. "He's this way," she said, not explaining why she knew that. I joined her in the hallway, and after my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that she was right. The skeleton man was standing at the end of the hall, stock still, waiting for us to come closer. "Nicholas?" Kate whispered as she approached. There was a hole in the floor that I would not have noticed. Thankfully, Kate did. She walked around it before she reached the man in the costume. She wrapped him in a big hug. "Oh, Nicholas! I knew it was you!" "Get away from him," I said. "That's not Nicholas." He was at least 3 inches taller than our brother. He had wider shoulders, too. The man hugged her back, but he seemed to be squeezing her really tight. Too tight. I carefully tried to pull Kate away from him. I almost did. Then suddenly the man let go and pushed us both backwards. Kate fell to the side, but I toppled backwards right into the hole in the floor. I landed in the dark basement below, my ankle snapping under me. I screamed in pain. The only light came from the hole above. I saw both Kate and the man look down at me. The man finally pulled off his mask, revealing a familiar face. It was Jason, Kate's on-again, off-again boyfriend. "Oops," he said, and Kate laughed. "What's going on?" "Turn to your left, babe," Kate called down at me. There was a body to my left. Nicholas's body. He was bloated and rotting. "You left him here to die?" I asked. "Yep," Kate said. "And we're going to do the same thing to you." They both disappeared from view. I could hear their thumping footsteps upstairs, and then the basement door creaked open, and the pair stepped down toward me. They took their sweet time, knowing that with my broken leg, I was trapped down there. I was at their mercy. Kate held a candle in one hand, the only source of light down here. Jason brought a box of rat poison and set it down next to me. They both stripped off their costumes so they could get more comfortable before they killed me. "Why?" I whimpered. Kate laughed and said, as casually as possible, that she wanted all our family inheritance for herself. With me and Nicholas out of the picture, she and her boyfriend could take all our family's money for themselves. "And no one will ever find your body," Jason bragged. He was immediately proven wrong when someone shouted at us from outside the house. Someone had followed us from the party. "Hello? Do you need help?" "Don't go anywhere," Kate told me. "We'll kill you when we get back." They took the candle with them, leaving me in total darkness with my brother's dead body while they dealt with the stranger. I thought about calling for help, but I knew that if the guy heard me, then Kate would probably just kill him too. I had a better idea. Wincing through the pain, I crawled towards the box of rat poison. Their discarded costumes were crumpled on the ground a few feet away. I sprinkled most of the poison onto the inside of their costumes, keeping my mouth and eyes squeezed shut in case any of it splattered on me. Then I crawled back to my original spot on the floor and put the box of poison back where they'd left it. I could hear their voices outside the house. They were making up some lame story about doing a seance in a haunted house. The guy seemed to buy it. Pretty soon, the man had left, and my would-be killers returned to the basement. "I'm so sorry I have to do this," Kate told me. "But you understand why I'm killing you, right?" The only way I could get out of here alive was if I could trick them into putting their costumes back on. Thankfully, my sister was easily manipulated. "You're missing the Halloween party. People are gonna notice." "Then we should kill you fast," she argued. "Or," I said, "and hear me out, you leave me here. I'm obviously not going anywhere. Once you've had your fun, you can come back and finish me off." The two of them looked at each other, considering my suggestion. With a shrug, they both slipped their costumes back on, neither noticing the poison coating the fabric. Jason left right away, but Kate stomped down on my other ankle, breaking that one too. "Just in case," she taunted before she left. Once again alone in the dark basement with my brother's body just a few feet away, I passed out from the pain. The next thing I knew, I was laying in a hospital bed with casts on both legs. A policeman sat by my bedside, waiting for me to wake up. He explained that he'd been called to the Halloween party after Kate and Jason had dropped dead in the middle of the dance floor. The poison had soaked into their bodies as they danced. The cop found me and Nicholas pretty soon afterward. He knew what I'd done, but he wasn't going to press charges. All he said was, "Good job."
Back in college, I worked at a 24-hour diner. It was a cute little place right next to my dorm building. Our customers were entirely college students, which meant that the diner got a bit crazy during mealtimes. That's why I always preferred to work the night shift. Night customers were always drunk or high, but there were never any lines. It was a chill job, it really was. Then, one night, my coworker, Libby, called in sick at the last minute. She'd covered for one of my shifts a week before, so it was time to return the favor. Without her, I had to man the kitchen and serve the customers at the same time. Thankfully, our nighttime menu was mostly pre-cooked meals, so all I had to do was warm things up. I could handle it no problem. For the first 3 hours of my shift, I had a handful of customers, all coming alone. 2 had the munchies, and 1 was in the middle of an all-nighter, typical nighttime customers. Then someone else came into the diner, a stranger. I'd never met him before. He was about 50 with a pointed goatee. Our school had a few older students, but I knew them all. This guy did not go to our school. He walked up to the counter and ordered chicken fingers and fries. His voice was weirdly intense. I took his money and heated up his food, but when I turned back around to face him, I saw that he was staring straight at me. He seemed nervous. "You're Bonnie, right?" How did he know that? I didn't have my name tag on. As I handed him his food, he started asking me personal questions. About my classes, about my mom, about my future plans. He seemed to know a lot about me, but I didn't know anything about him. I answered him politely, but concisely. I tried not to give away too much information about myself. After he asked me about my GPA, I'd had enough. "Who are you?" He took a deep breath, psyching himself up. Then he said, "Bonnie, I'm Wilson, your biological father." I was too shocked to speak. "I've been blocked from seeing you ever," he explained, "but I couldn't stop myself. I had to come here and meet you." I'd never known my father. My mom always said he was a one-night stand. She didn't even remember his name. And I'd always believed her. But this man did look a bit like me, and he seemed to be the right age. I didn't trust him yet, but I was intrigued. Another customer walked in, a freshman I recognized from one of my econ classes. I didn't know his name, but he seemed like a nice, slightly nerdy guy. He glanced suspiciously at my alleged father as he approached the counter. While he waited for me to take his order, Wilson slid a slip of paper into my hand. His address was written in big, scratchy letters. "Visit me after your shift and I'll explain everything." He paused for a second before adding, "Please." "Okay," I said. I was beyond excited. All my life I'd wanted to know who my real father was. I never realized how much it ate at me until that moment. I got the other customers' food ready while my dad ate alone. By the time I was done with the other customer, Wilson had finished his food and got up to leave. "Wait," I said, but he didn't. He smiled from the door and said, "I hope I see you soon. But if not, I completely understand." Then he was gone. When I went to his table, I saw the giant tip he'd left behind. He also wrote a note for me on the check. "I'm so proud of you." After he left, it was just me and the other customer in the restaurant. He ate his food, politely ignoring my conversation with my dad. But he must have heard everything because he said, "I wouldn't trust him if I were you." "Why?" "It's none of my business, but I think he's scamming you." I really wanted him to be wrong, but it was logical to be suspicious. Ignoring my own feelings, if I had overheard the same conversation, I would have thought it was a scam too. But I still had to find out for myself, meaning I needed to go to that address. Otherwise, the uncertainty would eat away at me. "If you're still planning to see him again," the customer suggested, "don't go alone." "Sure," I agreed, though I was still going to go. The customer could tell that I wasn't convinced. "Let me go with you. Just in case." Even though we didn't really know each other, it was a nice offer. I thought about it for a bit, and I agreed. The customer introduced himself as Thomas, once he realized that I didn't remember his name. He finished eating, but didn't leave. I still had 2 more hours left in the night shift, but I didn't care. I locked the restaurant, hung up the close sign, and left with Thomas. Together, we drove to my dad's address. I felt very comfortable with Thomas. He seemed determined to make sure that I was safe. The address led us to a trailer park on the edge of town. It was a grimy, trash-filled area, a huge departure from the upper-middle-class neighborhood where I'd grown up. We double-checked that we were in the right place, and then I told Thomas to wait in the car while I went inside. "Good luck," he called out to me. I reached the trailer's front door and knocked. My father instantly greeted me with a hug. "I knew you'd come!" He excitedly pulled me inside and closed the door behind me. The trailer looked so much nicer on the inside. It was well decorated and colorful. Everything was clean. I thought about running outside to tell Thomas he could leave, but I figured that would be awkward in front of Wilson. He gave me a quick tour of the trailer, which was small but very comfortable. He took me to what I thought was the back door and said, "I have a guest bedroom built just for you. It's been sitting empty all these years. You'll always have a place to stay here." He sounded genuinely excited to show me the room. He even made me close my eyes before I walked in. He wanted me to be surprised. With my eyes closed, I walked into the room and immediately heard a slam behind me. The door was shut and locked behind me. I was trapped. This wasn't a bedroom at all. It was a kennel. There were dog cages lining the walls, each with a pillow and blanket inside. That man was not my father. He was a criminal or something. He'd lured me here by pretending to be my dad. And judging by the room, I wasn't his first victim. Who knew how many other times he had pulled the exact same scam, pretending to be some long-lost father? It was terrible. Outside the door, the man told me to pick a cage for myself and settle in. He asked if I heard him, but I didn't answer. He didn't say anything after that. For the next few minutes, I looked around the room, trying to find some way to escape. Then, the door creaked open. I expected to see my abductor on the other side, but it was Thomas. He was smiling, a single streak of blood across his cheek. Behind him, my fake father was lying dead on the floor. He'd been bludgeoned. "Aren't you glad I came along?" Thomas asked. I wrapped him in a big hug. He'd just saved my life. We started dating after that, and we've been together ever since. The police connected my kidnapper, whose name really was Winslow, to at least a dozen other disappearances. But so far, none of the other women have been found. Oh, and I talked to my mom about my biological father. She insists he was just a one-night stand. I'm fine with that.
I'll never forget the look on her face when she walked into my office. Elizabeth Lark, the actress everyone once worshipped, reduced to a shadow of her former self. She had been a star, adored by millions, but time had been unkind to her. She sat across from me, her fingers tracing the delicate lines around her mouth, almost compulsively. "Can you fix me?" she asked, her voice strained, a mix of desperation and hope. She already knew the answer, of course. That's why she had come to me. We can do more than just fix you, I replied, leaning forward. The procedure I offer is unlike anything else in the world. The veil isn't just a facelift or a skin graft. It's a living, organic mask that bonds with your cells. It regenerates, keeps you looking young, permanently. Her eyes lit up, the faint flicker of a smile pulling at the corners of her lips. And it's safe? Safe? The word danced on the tip of my tongue, mocking me. Nothing this experimental was ever truly safe. But I'd seen the results, the others. They had come through the procedure perfectly. Mostly. As safe as anything in this field, I answered, evading the real question. The veil is groundbreaking. You'll never age, not another day. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. When do we start? The surgery went smoothly. Better than I expected, actually. I remember every cut, every incision, the way the mask, this flexible organic layer, melted onto her skin, as if it had always belonged there. Her body took to it perfectly. When she woke, I was there, waiting, anticipating the reaction. How do you feel? I asked, watching her eyes flutter open. Her hand shot to her face. I held my breath. There was always that moment of doubt, of fear that something would go wrong. But her face was flawless, smooth, youthful, radiant. She let out a small, incredulous laugh. I look perfect. Exactly as I promised, I said, my voice smooth, professional. But inside, I felt something I didn't usually allow myself to feel. Pride. I'd done it again. For the first few weeks, she would come into the clinic for checkups. Each time she glowed with that same youthful energy. Her skin remained taut, her features smooth and flawless. Even her eyes seemed to sparkle like they had in her prime. She had returned to the public eye, starring in interviews, walking red carpets. Her resurgence talked about everywhere. Then the call started. Dr. Voss? There's something wrong. Her voice trembled over the phone. Come in immediately, I said, trying to mask the unease creeping into my own chest. When she arrived, I could see it in her eyes. Fear. Something had shifted. She sat in the examination chair, her fingers trembling as they traced her jawline. Her skin was still smooth. Too smooth. I keep waking up at night. I feel it. Moving. I frowned. Moving? She nodded, eyes wide, bloodshot from lack of sleep. Underneath the surface, like something's crawling. I examined her, searching for any sign of infection, but there was nothing. Her skin was flawless. Too flawless. No pores, no imperfections. The veil was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Only too well. You're just adjusting to the new skin, I told her. The mask is part of you now. It regenerates. I can't feel it, she interrupted, her voice growing shrill. It doesn't feel like my skin anymore. It's too tight. It's like it's choking me. I leaned back, forcing a smile, trying to reassure her. You're going to be fine. Give it some time. A few more weeks passed, and her calls became more frantic. When she came in again, her face, it was still young, but something was terribly wrong. Her skin looked unnatural. Smooth, yes, but it had a shine to it, a tightness that was almost plastic-like. I tried to cut it, she whispered, holding up a pair of scissors and shaking hands. There were no marks on her face, no blood, no wounds. Elizabeth. I can't feel anything. It's not me. This mask, it's taken over. I can't breathe. I can't move. Her hands crawled at her cheeks, and I saw it. Her skin didn't move. It stayed perfectly in place, unmoving, like a second layer had hardened beneath. I reached out to stop her, but it was too late. She grabbed the scissors, thrusting them into her cheek with all her might. There was a dull thud, but no tear, no blood. Just the sickening realization that the veil was no longer just skin. It had become her. "Help me!" she screamed, pulling at her own face. But the veil didn't budge. It wouldn't come off. It was her now. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I realized what I'd done. The veil was supposed to regenerate her, keep her young, and it had. Forever.
I usually stayed away from my husband's office. There was nothing wrong with his company, but the building itself was in the one part of town that I never wanted to visit. Every once in a while, you'd hear about disappearances and random shootings in the area. A lot of people said that it was all mafia-related, but honestly, I didn't care. I just wanted Parker to be safe when he was at work. Because I didn't have a job of my own, I had a lot of respect for what he did. He was a great provider. Even on an office worker's salary, he always did buy me expensive presents and took me on trips. I felt like Parker and I had a great life together, but all that changed when I made a surprise visit to his office. Parker had been dealing with some work stress, and I decided to surprise him with a homemade lunch to cheer him up. He knew how much I disliked visiting his office. It was something we'd argue about a lot, so I figured a surprise visit would mean a lot to him. Unfortunately, I never actually got inside his building. I was still in the parking lot when I heard screaming and choking noises from the side of the building. They lasted for about 5 seconds before abruptly stopping. I peered around the corner and saw one man standing over a dead body. His back was to me, so I couldn't see his face. He had a rope in one hand and a murder weapon in his other. I backed away so the man couldn't see me and then pulled out my phone. I pressed the power button over and over, but it wouldn't turn on. I needed to charge it. Just then, the front door burst open and Parker ran out. "Sammy, did you see anything?" I hugged him tightly. I could barely get the words out, but I told him what I'd seen. He immediately pulled away and grabbed his own phone and dialed 911. I was so impressed by how calmly he relayed all the information. He ended the call and told me, "The officer said that we should leave right now for our own safety. They'll send someone over to the house and get the statement." I was so glad I didn't have to stay there any longer. Parker and I got in our separate cars and drove back home. As I pulled onto the street, I looked once more at the murder scene. The body was still there, but the killer was already gone. Parker wasn't kidding when the FBI agent was parked in our driveway waiting for us. He had sunglasses hiding his face, but he looked friendly enough. After we got out of the car, he introduced himself as Agent Bradford. He said that the murder I'd witnessed was mob-related, so the police immediately asked him to protect me. The agent explained that he'd take me temporarily into witness protection. I'd have to stay there until the killer was captured, at which point I'd be called in to testify. I didn't even have time to pack. Agent Bradford said that the house was already prepared for my arrival, including all the clothes and toiletries that I needed. Time was of the essence, so he had to relocate me immediately. Parker and I got into the back of his government-issued vehicle and drove us right out of town. He took us high into the mountains, along side roads instead of the main highway. After about an hour on those winding dirt roads, he parked in front of an old secluded cabin. We all got out of the car, with Parker carrying my suitcase. Agent Bradford unlocked the front door, giving me a quick tour of the tiny single-story cabin. It seemed like a miserable place to stay. I prayed that I wouldn't be cooped up here for that long. Agent Bradford checked that I had everything that I needed. Then, once he was satisfied, he said that he'd head back to town and check on me in a few days. He reminded me that I had to stay in the house no matter what. I thanked him for all the help. "Of course," the agent said. "Parker, are you ready to go?" That's when I started to panic. Until that moment, I assumed that Parker and I would be sequestered here together. I hadn't even noticed that the agent only brought a suitcase for me. Bradford explained that Parker wasn't allowed to stay with me because he hadn't seen the killer. I had. It didn't really make sense, but before I could argue, he kissed me on the mouth, and then Bradford and him hurried back outside. "I'll come back soon. Just hang out. Have a rest," Bradford called to me as he drove away. I started to scroll through my phone when I realized that the cabin didn't even have internet. I tried to call Parker, but I didn't have reception either. I was completely cut off from the rest of the world. Even though I started to panic, I felt this sudden urge to take a nap. It was still mid-afternoon, but I guess all the trauma of the day had drained me of energy. I laid down on the sofa, and I would have immediately fallen asleep if a couch spring hadn't poked me in the back. I stood up to adjust the cushion when I noticed a slip of paper on the ground that must have fallen out of someone's pocket. I unfolded it, revealing the blueprints for Parker's office with a red X drawn exactly where the murder happened. The more I stared at the paper, the more I started to panic. Who made this? This must have been left here before the crime occurred, meaning this cabin wasn't really a safe house at all. It was where the killer and his accomplices had planned the murder. Agent Bradford wasn't really an FBI agent. He was duping us. In fact, he had the exact same build as the killer. Maybe they were the same person, and Bradford had intercepted Parker's 911 call or something. Unless I was overreacting. Parker always scolded me for jumping to conclusions. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But just to be safe, I started walking around the house to see if there was anything else I could find out that was out of the ordinary. I couldn't find anything. Plus, it was really hard to concentrate. All I wanted to do was take a nap. When I walked into the kitchen, I noticed a soft hissing noise coming from behind the oven. I peered over and saw that the gas line had been cut. No wonder I was feeling so tired. The whole cabin was slowly filling with odorless gas. If I had fallen asleep on the couch, I would have been killed. Covering my mouth, I unlocked the back door and raced out. I looked at the thick forest around the cabin. There was nowhere to go. Then, I saw movement coming from the dirt road. Agent Bradford's car was driving back. I crouched down so no one could see me, and I watched as both Bradford and Parker stepped out of the car. They were talking and laughing. I couldn't hear them at first until they got close enough to me. Then Parker said, "You go switch off the gas. I'll grab the body." Parker and the fake FBI agent were in this together. I felt like screaming. How could Parker, the love of my life, do this to me? How could he be so nonchalant about grabbing my dead body? But I just kept quiet as both men walked inside the gas-filled cabin, each covering their mouths. The window in front of me was just open enough. I lit a match and threw it inside. Then, as I ran as fast as I could, I avoided the explosion. That served them both right.
I remember that night so vividly. The night I first met Jennifer. It was late, nearly midnight, and I was sitting alone in a dimly lit bar, nursing a whiskey and trying to forget the latest breakup that had torn my heart apart. The place was nearly empty, save for the bartender cleaning glasses and a few regulars lost in their drinks. Then, she walked in. She was stunning. Long, dark hair that flowed down her back like a waterfall, eyes that shimmered with a mysterious depth, and a smile that could melt away even the darkest thoughts. She sat next to me without hesitation, ordering a drink with a confidence that caught me off guard. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice soft and soothing. I nodded, too surprised by her presence to speak. She didn't pry, didn't push, just sat there, her company somehow calming. That night we talked for hours. She was everything I had ever dreamed of. Beautiful, kind, and so full of life. By the end of the night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A connection, a spark. We exchanged numbers, and from that moment, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Our relationship blossomed quickly. It felt perfect, almost too perfect. Every date was magical. Every conversation left me wanting more. But as time passed, I noticed something off. Jennifer never slept. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find her sitting by the window, just staring out into the darkness, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight. When I asked her about it, she'd just smile, that faint, almost sad smile, and say she wasn't tired. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was just a night owl or someone who didn't need much sleep. But the longer we were together, the stranger it got. Her skin grew paler, almost translucent, and her eyes darkened, the vibrant sparkle slowly fading into something hollow. She moved with a sluggishness that made her seem exhausted, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. But whenever I asked if she was okay, she would dismiss my concern with a gentle laugh, telling me not to worry. One night, after a particularly eerie encounter where I found her standing in the middle of the living room, staring at nothing, she told me she needed to go to her mom's house for a while. I was concerned, but she insisted she'd be fine. I wanted to push her to stay, to tell me what was wrong, but something in her eyes made me stop. I told her I'd miss her and to call me when she got there. But she never did. Days went by, and I heard nothing. My calls and texts went unanswered. Each passing day felt like a dagger twisting deeper into my gut. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The fear gnawed at me, consuming every thought. Finally, after 5 agonizing days, I decided to call her mom, desperate for any news. When I introduced myself, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't know you," her mother said, her voice shaky and uncertain. I was confused. "I'm Jennifer's boyfriend," I explained, my heart pounding in my chest. "We've been dating for a while now." There was silence. Then her mother whispered words that shattered my world. Jennifer died 4 years ago." I felt the ground slip from beneath me. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend what I just heard. No, that's impossible," I stammered. But her mother was insistent. "Jennifer had died in a car accident 4 years ago," she said, her voice breaking with sorrow. My head spun, memories of the past few months flashing through my mind. The late nights, her pale skin, her sad smiles. It all began to make a twisted, horrifying sense. I hung up without saying goodbye, the phone slipping from my hand as I collapsed onto the couch. For days, I locked myself in my apartment, drowning in despair and confusion. How could this be possible? How could I have fallen in love with someone who didn't exist? I sank into a deep depression, plagued by anger and loss. I couldn't even bring myself to step outside, afraid of the world, afraid of the truth. Then, one night, as I lay in bed, I felt a presence. I opened my eyes and there she was. Jennifer, standing by the window, just as she always had. But this time, there was something different. Her skin glowed faintly, her eyes soft and warm. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice like a breeze. "I didn't mean to hurt you, I didn't want to be alone." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Tears streamed down my face as I watched her. Slowly, she walked over to me, placing a cold hand on my cheek. "You were my last wish," she said, her voice barely audible. "I just wanted to feel alive again, even if only for a little while." And then Just like that, she was gone. The room felt empty, colder somehow, but there was a strange sense of peace that settled over me. It hurt, knowing I'd never see her again, but in that moment, I knew she had found her peace too.
I'm not really into keeping old furniture around, but that couch was different. It had been with me through the better part of the last decade. It was a hand-me-down from an ex. She loved the thing, always draping it in blankets like it was some sacred artifact. I always thought it was ugly. It was mid-century modern with green and yellow stripes. After she left me, I found myself increasingly irritated by its presence. So, after another night of sitting on its overhyped cushions, I finally decided it had to go. I listed it on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. It was a simple post, just a few photos and a short description. Old couch, worn but comfortable, free to anyone who can pick it up. Within 5 minutes, I got a response. That was a red flag I should have caught. The buyer messaged me through Craigslist and Facebook. That should have been a red flag. Who gets that excited over an ugly couch? The guy introduced himself as Jared. He fired off messages faster than I could read them. "I'll be there tonight," one read. "Can I come sooner?" another said. I told him I wouldn't be available until the evening, but that didn't stop him from repeatedly asking if I could make an exception. I made him wait for when I was available, and he messaged me until I told him he could come. When Jared finally showed up, I instantly regretted putting the ad up. He was tall, with a thick beard and eyes that darted nervously around the room. He didn't come alone either. A woman stood by the door. She was tall and slender and looked as uneasy as Jared, though she never spoke. Jared practically pounced on the couch the moment I let them in, rubbing his hands over the fabric like it was made of gold. "This is the one," he mumbled, almost to himself. "You don't know what you've got here, man." It's just a couch," I replied, trying to laugh off his odd behavior. Jared's head snapped up, and he smiled. "Yeah, sure, just a couch." Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, but I didn't care enough to dig into it. If the guy wanted the couch that badly, he could have it. He handed me $50, even though I told him it was free. I took the cash, figuring it was the quickest way to get him out of my apartment. They struggled with the couch for a few minutes, maneuvering it awkwardly through my front door, and then, just like that, they were gone. I felt a wave of relief. The couch was out of my life for good. I didn't give it another thought until around midnight when I got a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have let it go." I stared at the message, my stomach turning. Before I could reply, another message came in. It belonged to someone important. My mind raced as I stared at the phone, trying to figure out what was going on. I hadn't mentioned the couch to anyone else. The messages kept coming, growing more aggressive with each one. "You've made a mistake. They're watching you." That's when I decided to dig into the history of the couch. I had never really considered where it came from. Years ago, my ex picked it up from a secondhand store, and that was that. But now, something felt off. I needed to know more. I called the store where she'd bought it. The owner barely remembered the couch, but told me that it had been part of an estate sale. That got my attention. Estate sales usually meant that someone had died, and from the way Jared had acted, I had a bad feeling about this particular death. I dug more, and eventually found a local news article from about 12 years ago. It detailed the murder of a young woman, Claudia Holloway, in her upscale downtown apartment. She had been found dead on her couch. The article didn't detail the couch itself, but I only needed a photograph of the crime scene. Sure enough, there it was, as ugly as the day Jared and his friend carried it away. Except, in the picture, the green and yellow stripes were stained with blood. The article didn't include any details of the murder. I sat there in the dark, staring at the photograph, debating whether this could be my couch or not. For all I knew, IKEA made the couch and everyone had one like it. Although it wasn't in IKEA's minimalist style, I abandoned that excuse. It didn't make any sense. Why would anyone be so obsessed with a piece of furniture? But then again, Jared's strange behavior would make some sense if he knew about this murder. And those texts, they're watching you. Who were they? As I dug deeper, I found out that Claudia Holloway wasn't just some random victim. She came from money. Old money. The kind of money that didn't just go away after someone died. Her family must have been one of influence because they were the ones behind the Holloway Library, Holloway Park, and, according to my research, they made sizable donations to the current mayor. The police investigation into her murder had been suspiciously quiet, too. The case had gone cold quickly, and the couch had eventually disappeared into the ether of estate sales and secondhand shops. But why was it so important? I found out the next morning when 2 men showed up at my door. At first, I thought they were cops, but they didn't look like cops. They looked more like businessmen, with clean-cut, tailored suits and stern faces that looked like they meant serious business. The taller of the 2 spoke first. "We're here to talk about your couch," he continued. "You should have never let it go." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's so important about a couch?" The other man's lips curled into a tight smile. "It's not the couch that's important, it's what's hidden inside." My heart skipped a beat. "Inside?" He nodded. "The family who originally purchased the couch had secrets they didn't want anyone to find. That couch was custom built to hide something valuable, something dangerous." My mind raced. Was that why Jared had been so obsessed with it? Did he know about the hidden compartment? The second man, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "We don't care who has it, we just need to make sure it stays buried. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah, I get it." The 2 men exchanged a glance before the taller one spoke again. "Good. Then we won't have a problem. Is the couch here?" I shook my head. "No, some man named Jared took it last night." The men looked at each other. The tall one let out a deep sigh. "Do you know this man's last name?" My hands were shaking as I took my phone out of my pocket to show the man Jared's Facebook profile. When I clicked on it, I found the profile had been deleted. Sorry, I don't know his last name, but I can give you his number." One of the men pulled up a picture on his phone. "Did he look like this?" Sure enough, he showed me a picture of Jared. I nodded. They turned and left without another word, leaving me standing there, heart pounding in the doorway. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I kept thinking about what might be hidden inside that couch. Something so important that people were willing to threaten me to keep it hidden. I thought about Jared, too. What had he gotten himself into? The next morning I tried to call him, but the number he'd given me was disconnected. He had vanished, just like the couch. A week went by, with no word from Jared, no more strange messages, and no sign of the 2 men in suits. I started to think that maybe it was all over. The couch, and whatever secrets it held, were gone for good. But late one night, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, there was nothing there. Just a small envelope taped to the doorframe. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in neat, careful handwriting. "Some secrets should stay buried." I never heard from Jared again. But every so often, I still think about that couch and what it might have been hiding. I wonder if the people who wanted it buried are still watching me. I hope I never find out. I moved to Utah for work. I rented a cozy little house in a nice neighborhood. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. But after a few days, I started to get the sense that my neighbors didn't like me. They all kept their distance, and whenever I saw them on the street, they seemed weirdly nervous. It was October, so of course I decorated my house for Halloween. It was my favorite holiday, and I brought a bunch of fun retro decorations with me. I thought that if I went all out with my decorations, I'd give my neighbors a reason to come over and talk to me. It was like a conversation starter. Unfortunately, the exact opposite happened. People avoided me even more than usual. In fact, the only person who ever talked to me was my next-door neighbor, Frank, a retired widower who looked particularly cranky. He walked into my front yard as I was setting out all my jack-o'-lanterns and told me to take everything down.
You really shouldn't decorate in our neighborhood, especially for Halloween.
He sounded pretty threatening, but I told him that this was my house and I could decorate it as I wanted. The neighborhood didn't have an HOA or anything, and my rental agreement didn't say anything about holiday decorations. When it was clear that I wasn't going to back down, he left. For the next week or so, I felt more and more like an outcast in my own home. I liked my new job, and I liked the house itself, but I felt so uncomfortable in the neighborhood. The air itself felt tense and uninviting. Then, one morning, I found a slip of paper under my front door. It was an invitation for a Halloween party for everyone in the neighborhood. Halloween was still a few days away, but the party was scheduled for that night. It gave an address from a few streets over, as well as a 6 o'clock starting time. The only other information was a message to wear a family-friendly costume. I was so happy to be included. I didn't want to rock the boat any more than I already had, so I bought an angel costume at Walmart. I wanted to wear something more fun, like an undead cheerleader outfit or something, but I thought that an angel would be less likely to offend my obviously more religious neighbors. I arrived at the address exactly at 6, but the house was empty. There were no cars nearby, and the lights were all off. Worse, there was a for sale sign in the front. And that's when I knew that someone was pranking me. I hate to admit it, but I started to cry. I sat on the empty doorstep, sadness washing over me. I should never have come here. I didn't belong. It took a while to calm myself down. Then I got back in my car and drove home. I was so upset that I didn't realize that my front door was wide open until I stepped onto my porch. Someone had broken into my house while I was gone. Whoever had given me the fake invitation must have used it as a way to get me out of the house. My entire living room was trashed. All my Halloween decorations were broken. And worst of all, someone had smeared "Go home" on my wall. Judging by the texture and smell, they'd written the message in feces. I backed out of my house in disbelief. No one had ever been this cruel to me before. Suddenly, someone appeared at my side. It was my neighbor, Frank, asking if I was okay. His face looked concerned, but I knew that was an act. "Why do you hate me so much?" I asked him. My voice came out high-pitched and whiny, but I didn't care. He nervously looked around the empty street, and he asked if we could talk in private. He wanted me to go into his house. "No!" I shouted. "Go away!" He started to respond, but he stopped himself. He could see how angry I was. I stared him down until he retreated back into his house. I waited on my porch for a while, trying to figure out what to do. My whole house reeked of manure. I didn't want to go back inside. But if I didn't clean up soon, the smell would soak into the walls. I hated living here. I hated Frank for doing this to me, and I hated all my other neighbors for letting it happen. Before I knew it, the old lady from across the street walked toward me. "You okay?" she asked gently. I'd seen her before, but always from a distance. She looked a lot like my own grandmother. She helped me to my feet and asked me if I'd like to go to her house and talk about it. Finally, a moment of kindness. I followed her across the street, feeling some of my anger fade away. She brought me inside and she started fixing us some tea. Her house was immaculate. There wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. I could tell from her framed pictures that she was a religious woman. She said her name was Sally, and she'd seen Frank sneak out of my house just moments before I got back. She apologized for his actions, adding that Frank had already scared off at least 5 other neighbors in the last few years. "And you let him get away with it?" I asked. I pulled out my phone, ready to call the police and report him. Sally stopped me.
You can't, she said. Frank has connections with the police. They're not going to believe you. In fact, they'll probably blame you.
She handed me a cup of tea. I genuinely hate tea, so I only pretended to drink. I didn't want to be rude. "I'm still going to call the police anyway."
"Don't," she insisted. "It's hopeless. Once Frank decides that he disapproves of someone, he won't stop until they move away. That's probably your best option."
Deep down, I knew she was right. I couldn't live next door to someone so heartless.
"I hate to say this," Sally continued, "but you should probably just go home, like he wrote on the wall."
I slowly realized something. "How did you know what he wrote? Did you go inside my house?" Panic flashed across her face. She knew she'd been caught in a lie. "You did it," I said. "Frank had warned me not to put up the decorations because he knew that you were a psycho, right? Right?" Sally took a deep breath. "You caught me," she said. "But it's too late for you to do anything about it. Feeling sleepy?" I knew in that moment that she had put sleeping pills in my tea. Thank God I didn't drink any of it. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. She rose from her chair and stood over me, beaming from ear to ear. "Because we don't need you here." She casually explained that her cousin was my landlord, the guy I was renting my new house from. All she has to do is tell him that I trashed my own house, and he'd believe her. He'd kick me out, just like all the other heathens who tried to enter her neighborhood. Well, she wouldn't have told me all this if she'd known that I wasn't drugged. I gripped the teacup really tightly, and as she leaned closer, I splashed the hot liquid into her face. Then I jumped up and raced out of her house. When I opened the door, Frank was standing just outside. He was waiting for me, his face full of concern. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen to you," I said, as Sally whimpered in pain behind me. I noticed that he held buckets of wet manure in each hand. He must have gotten them from Sally's backyard, the same manure she had used to deface my house. I wasn't sure why he'd brought those buckets to the front door. They were evidence against Sally, so he shouldn't have touched them. But then, he handed one of the buckets to me and said, "Her reign of terror ends tonight." Sally was on the floor now, furiously wiping at her burned eyes. We both walked back in with the manure. He took his bucket and he splashed it around the room, making sure to soak Sally with it. I followed his lead. We coated her spotless living room with feces, finally turning the tables on her. Then Frank left without saying anything. I did too. When we got back to my house, Frank helped me clean up all the wreckage. A couple other neighbors joined us. I'd never met them before, but they'd all had their own run-ins with Sally in the past. That night, I finally made some friends. I never saw Sally again. She moved away after that. I guess she was afraid to show her face in the community anymore. And as soon as she was gone, more Halloween decorations came up all around the neighborhood. Without Sally's influence, we were all free to celebrate the holiday in peace.